All right, so now we are at Act 4, Faust Part 2, Act 4. And I had thought that for some reason the classical Walpurgis Nacht was the last thing of Faust that Goethe wrote before he died. But as it turns out, as the commentator says here, that this Act 4 actually was the last thing he wrote in the first 6 months of 1831. And then he died 8 months later. Thank God he lived long enough to finish this. Act 4 is essential to connect the Helena, Act 3, with Act 5, Faust's land reclamation project. And so now, as we have seen all throughout Faust, this alternation of Eros on the one hand and Thanatos, or war, on the other, has gone back and forth like a beating heart, a systole and diastole, through the whole epic. And now, so we're back in war mode here. And as this opens up, Act 4 is the shortest of all the acts in Part 2. It contains 3 scenes. This first one here, High Mountains. And so I found a German romantic painting here that has the 2 different types of clouds that Goethe refers to here. The cumulus clouds here on the right and the cirrus clouds there on the left. And a mountain in the background. We could imagine Faust waking up on this mountain. And so Helen's garment, which he clasped as she was disappearing into the underworld, he grabbed her garment, and the garment then carries him up to this high mountain, and then the garment floats off on the right here to become the cumulus clouds that form the shape of a woman's body. And he associates then cumulus clouds with Helen, and the cirrus clouds over there on the left, which are more wispy, with Gretchen. And so let's read this opening monologue, which also loops back. Faust is here alone. It loops back to the opening monologue of Part 2, where Faust found himself waking up in a meadow with Ariel singing songs around him, and with his vision of a rainbow. And here, so the vision of the rainbow there, which was the power of divinity stepped down through human art and culture in the form of the rainbow, is here traded out for the vision of the 2 different types of clouds. And so Faust says, "The most profound of solitudes beholding underfoot, I circumspectly tread the margin of these peaks. Dismiss my aerial engine." Interesting, I don't know what the German word is there that's translated as aerial, but it does link back to Ariel, the spirit of the air at the beginning of Part 2, that hovers over him as he's sleeping, which on cloudless days has spirited me gently over land and sea. And note too that we also begin with the element of air here, because as this scene unfolds, we're going to drop down through all 4 elements, starting with the air, 4 classical elements. "It slowly separates from me without dispersing. The essence forges eastward in compacted train. The admiring eye pursues it in amazement lost. It parts in floating, undulating, changeably. Yet would adopt a shape, yes. I'm not deceived. On sun-gilt holstery in wondrous splendor laid, of Titan size indeed, a godlike female form, I see it well, resembling Juno, Leda, Helena. In what majestic loveliness it wavers in my sight. Alas, too soon deformed. I've seen many shapes in clouds all the time. It's almost like a regular occurrence. And it's funny that you watch the shape and you're 100% convinced that it's like a dragon, or a couple having sex. I've even seen that. I've seen all kinds of things, and then watch it drift and change form as it disintegrates and moves away, and you wonder if such a shape was ever there. He says, distended, shapelessly amassed, it hulks at Orient, to the east, like a distant Arctic range, its glamour mirroring deep sense of fleeting days. And then he says, about my breast and brow, a shining band of mist, still hovers, though, exhilarating, tender, cool. These are cirrus clouds now, wisping about him. Now lightly, hesitantly, it ascends, higher and higher, takes form. Am I received by an enchanting shape, as of long-lost, most cherished boon of earliest youth? And so Goethe has said, though he doesn't say it here, in one of his documents, that he meant this to be Gretchen. The inmost heart's primordial treasures rise again. Aurora's love, winged impetus, it means to me. The swiftly felt first, scarcely comprehended glance that he saw when he was the young Faust and she was coming out of a cathedral, that cotton held, outglittered any gem. Like beauty of the soul, the lovely image is enhanced and undissolving wafts along into the ether, drawing away with it the best my soul contains. And so that's his opening monologue here, in which the cumulus cloud sort of represents, Goethe associates it with Helen and with the sculptural beauty of classical art, which he so much loved under his Winckelmannian influence. Winckelmann had published The History of the Art of Antiquity in 1764, which Goethe read and loved. And then the cirrus clouds with Gretchen representing romantic art, especially the romantic art that produces images of the Virgin Mary and images like that is a little more fleeting and wispy and not quite so sculpturally grounded in tactility and in solidity. So those are the associations then with Helen and Gretchen, and we don't see them again until the very end with the final apotheosis. And then along comes Mephistopheles hitching a ride on this giant. The stage directions are a 7-mile boot, pads on stage. Another follows presently. Mephistopheles dismounts and the boots hurry on, which I think is very funny. And he drops off, and it's some sort of giant that he's hitched a ride on. And he's like, now that was rapid transport for us. But tell me, what are you about? Debarking in the midst of horrors and grimly yawning rock redoubt. So his attitude here toward Faust is very similar to the attitude that he had when Faust had the monologue in Forest and Cave, which we saw just after he was about to get it on with Gretchen, after he just met her. And there was a long monologue there, and Mephistopheles had shown up and said, what are you stuck on yourself again? I mean, come on, we've got worlds to conquer. And then Mephistopheles now says, he talks about old myths, Nordic myths, of the formation of the earth by devils and demons. Especially, Mephistopheles says that the earth was formed by demons that were cast out of heaven during the war in heaven, as described by Milton magnificently in Paradise Lost. And were cast out, and he says they wound up down in the earth, belching and farting, and all the gases and sulfur pushed the earth up and shoved up its mountains. But the significance of this then is once again, we're back to volcanism. We're back to the idea of creation by fire, creation of the earth's crust by fire. And so he says, when the Almighty, I know well wherefore, this is Mephistopheles, from air did banish us to depths of wrath, where all about us from a glowing core eternal blazes ate their flaming path, we found ourselves amid excessive brightness. This is book 1 of Paradise Lost, where all the devils and demons have been cast out of heaven, and in hell they create the palace, pandemonium, all the gods. We found ourselves amid excessive brightness, pent up in most uncomfortable tightness. The devils altogether started coughing, blew out from upper and from nether offing. Hell swelled with acid stench and sulfur reek. What press of gas there was! It reached the Titan peak, so that at last the level earthen crust, thick as it was, burst with the rending thrust. The cloth has now been given a new tweak. What was the base one time is now the peak. And so forth. And then Faust says, enough for your legends and so forth. And Mephistopheles says, no, I was there. That's how it happened. And so Mephistopheles now refers to he's like, don't you have anything that you want to do? He says here, you have surveyed immeasurable stretches, the kingdoms of this world and all their riches. And yet, insatiable as you are, you felt no appetite so far? This is now Goethe's reference to the third temptation of Christ in Matthew 4, in which, and it's a very important temptation because it becomes the segue from Magian civilization to the whole point of Faustian civilization, where the devil takes Christ up to a mountaintop and shows him all the kingdoms of the world, and he says, behold, all these kingdoms can be yours. So thus appealing to Christ's power drive. And then the response is the idea, no, I don't want power over the kingdoms of the earth. The kingdom of heaven will do just fine, which resolves it for that civilization, not for the Faustian. We took the devil up on that wager, and that's why we have the Faust myth. We will take possession over the earth in Western Faustian civilization. That's the whole point of its myth. And Faust says, yes, one great thing did tempt me. One, you guess at it. And Mephistopheles says, that's quickly done. I choose a typical metropolis And so he goes into a description of how he would like to create a decadent, dying world city, as Spengler calls them, the megalopolises that appear in the end phases of civilizations. Mephistopheles wants to create one of those, but Faust says, no, what I want to do is actually reclaim land from the sea. The tides just keep coming in, and there's all this wasted energy there, and I want to build dams and dikes, and Goethe here is foreseeing the coming of hydroelectric dams to push the ocean back, reclaim land from the sea, and build a utopian city there, my city. And so we're moving into Goethe's own idea of the end stages of a civilization when its interest becomes strictly extensive, no longer metaphysically intensive, but geographically extensive through empire building and the creation of boring, banal suburbs, apartment skyscrapers, and so forth. That's what Faust wants to do. And Mephistopheles says, that's not a problem, whatever you want. And so note, too, that the way in which Faust brings up the ocean now is Neptunism. So now we flip back again from volcanism, creation by fire, to now Neptunism, except that whereas we saw that the ocean is the source of all life in the classical Walpurgisnacht, here Faust just sees it as a source of energy, thus anticipating Heidegger's whole idea of technology as a form of being that is decadent and degenerate and has to do with the enframing of the earth. Where you just look at a mountain and you don't say it's beautiful or sublime, you say, I bet we could get a lot of metal out of that mountain. And so the technological way of understanding being is that you rape the earth and its resources for standing reserve to be called upon. And he talks about hydroelectric dams in that essay of his, The Question Concerning Technology. And that is precisely the question that Goethe is foreseeing here as he winds down his last few days and foresees the coming of what industrial civilization will end up doing to the earth. And so we move from from fire to water, and then with its ironic inversion where it's not creative, it's just a source of energy for Faust. So he's in his late degenerate, decadent period as he personifies the soul of Faustian civilization. Now we're moving into the late phase. And then they hear the sound of war drums. And so now everything shifts to the idea of war. So now we're back to the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, who in the original Faust myth is supposed to be Emperor Charles V, but Goethe makes him generic, smartly, I think. And a rival emperor has risen to contend with him over the fact that the paper currency that Mephistopheles introduced into the realm has caused rampant inflation and now all sorts of problems. And so Faust, in order to get his land grant from the emperor, will have to help him win this war against this rival upstart emperor. And so Mephistopheles then says, okay, I'll make you a general and we'll fight this war for the emperor. And he says, I have these 3 soldiers. Here they are. These 3 phantom soldiers, pugnacious, rapacious, and tenacious. And I think it's really funny the way Goethe introduces them. Pugnacious is young, lightly armed, and colorfully dressed. Then out comes rapacious, who is mature, well armed, and richly dressed. And then finally tenacious is elderly, heavily armed, and unclothed. He's naked. This naked old man is going to lead a contingent. Indeed, as we'll see, it's the contingent that fails and needs more magical aid from Mephistopheles. So the older they get, the more heavily armed they become, as though tenacious, to compensate for his old age, needs heavier equipment. All right, so then we move into the second scene in the foothills, in which now the emperor and Faust and Mephistopheles are, and also the emperor's commander-in-chief, are looking out at the battle between the 2 rival armies. Let's pull up a battle image here, which I've chosen Piero della Francesca's painting of the emperor, the Byzantine emperor Heraclius, going to war against the Sasanian Zoroastrian emperor Khosroes. And I just like the way he's woven in here with the 2 armies, their heraldry, which I want to get into, which Goethe weaves in here as well. Since the eagle became the primary heraldic symbol of the Holy Roman Empire. And so they're talking and they're looking out at the battle. And it's almost as though the rival emperor that Goethe had in mind, perhaps the investiture controversy of 1070, in which Pope Gregory VII tried to arrogate all this power to the papacy, which had been very weak under the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, who was very powerful and had appointed lay vassals to be able to appoint offices of the papacy to power, or of the Catholic Church to power. And Pope Gregory said, absolutely not. There is no such thing as lay investiture. It's not going to happen. And so what ended up happening is that Henry IV came along, and Pope Gregory VII excommunicated him, and then Henry's nobles then appointed a rival emperor, Rudolf of Swabia, and they had a civil war, basically, which was the kickoff to the investiture controversy. Rudolf was defeated, and then an anti-pope was elected put forth by Henry IV, who then marched on Rome and beat the pope and ousted him. So it kind of, I wonder if Goethe had something like that in mind here with this rival emperor and the struggle between papacy and empire. So the emperor, they're looking out, and then Faust shows up now over this cliff that the emperor's standing on. They're looking at the armies, and he shows up with these three soldiers that Mephistopheles has just created, these three phantom soldiers, rapacious, pugnacious, and tenacious. And so note too there that we have yet another quaternio. Faust with these three forms another quaternio. We saw a quaternio with Phorcys as Mephisto with the three Grii. So here's another one. And now Faust says, look, you're going to need these guys to help your men. So they appoint Pugnacious, the young man, to the right, the right flank. And in the center they appoint Rapacious, the mature man. And they're appointed in exactly the same order that Goethe invoked them to begin with. And then Tenacious, the old man, is on the left flank. And as we know, the left is always the weak side, supposedly. The sinister side, the side of the woman, the spiritual, the supernatural, all that kind of stuff. And so then they send them out, and then Mephistopheles now has created an army, basically a robot army. It's just because what he has done is to gather all the empty suits of armor that people have been collecting, and he's animated them. They're empty, but yet they form an army. So it's basically a robot army that he then sends out, led by these three major characters, and then they do well on the right flank and in the middle, but of course the left flank runs into problems. And then they see an omen of this eagle fighting with a griffin, and of course the eagle is the symbol for the Holy Roman Empire, especially the double-headed eagle, which actually the Holy Roman Empire inherited from the Hittites. Here's the Hittite prototype of it, and the Hittites were masters of Asia Minor, which later becomes part of the Byzantine Empire, and then the Holy Roman Empire inherits this symbol as their primary herald. And then so they see an eagle in the air, which represents then the emperor's army, fighting a griffin, which represents then the rival emperor's army. And the eagle defeats the griffin, and Mephistopheles and Faust see this as a positive omen. The emperor takes some convincing, and his left flank isn't doing very well. And so then Mephistopheles then brings in his two ravens, which of course are ravens that have been borrowed from Odin or Wotan, Hugin and Munin, who had these two ravens, as more properly Nordic birds, who descend down onto the battlefield, and they survey what's going on, and they come back to Mephistopheles and tell him what's going on, and he says, I see we need some more magical aid here. So he has a group of undines, which are female water spirits that we have not seen since the opening scenes of Faust Part 1. And they unleash from the cliffs all of these floods that flood the rival emperor's army. A bunch of people die. And then these dwarves who he pulls out of the mountains, and the dwarves create this fire. It doesn't say what it is. It's some sort of fire that then startles the rival emperor's armies. And then finally, the walking empty suits of armor emit a terrifying din, a terrifying sound that creates panic, Remember that the emperor had appeared in the carnival in the guise of Pan. So it creates panic. And then, so once again, note too that we have gone back to water and fire, which we started with in this act, and then it ends with air, with this din, and that terrifies the rival emperor's troops. And the emperor wins the battle, but he has to resort to sorcery and magic and necromancy on the part of Mephistopheles to do it. And then, so in this final scene, the rival emperor's tent, which we can look back at Peter Stein's play, who has it here, where we have, it's broken into three parts, where initially Rapacious and his paramour, which is a woman that is just called Grabswag, and they're in here robbing all the treasure from the rival emperor's tent. And this is, of course, Napoleon's sort of satirical glance, or rather Goethe's satirical glance at Napoleon's armies, which he had lived through, going across Europe, and as they went, looting all of its treasures and carrying them off to Paris. That's a sort of satire of that. And then in comes the emperor here with his four princes who have appointed him power. And so the protocol is for the Holy Roman Emperor that he has to go back to those four princes and reward them with new titles. And so the Elector of Saxony, and Saxony is in the north of the Holy Roman Empire, is made an archmarshal. That is the primary marshal of the emperor. Whereas the Elector of Brandenburg, which is slightly to the northeast there, is made the Archchamberlain. And here's the emperor here with his four princes. And so they would correspond symbolically to the four world quarters, north, south, east, west, even though literally geographically they don't, because we have the Elector Palatine, who becomes the Archsteward, and then finally the Elector of Bohemia, which is to the east, below Brandenburg, becomes the arch cupbearer, the one who's in charge, of course, of all the food. And so once he sort of cements his reign now over his empire, which has been secured, and now they have access to all this treasure that they didn't get out of the earth, as Mephistopheles promised, but they did get it from the rival emperor, all this gold and treasure that can now be used to back the paper currency that Mephistopheles had unleashed and which had caused this war and all this chaos. And then so the scene ends then with the archbishop now coming in. And so whenever we have the Holy Roman Emperor, there's always a struggle with papacy. So the archbishop comes in and he says, well, you know what? You did this all in league with the devil. I saw the devil out there giving you all this power. And so these are ill-gotten gains that you have here. And so your conscience should be freighted with guilt, and you're going to have to make penitence for this. And the emperor says, okay, what is it that you would like me to do? And he says, well, for one thing, you're going to have to construct a cathedral, a Gothic cathedral with some of this wealth. So you'll construct that, and then that'll be the primary thing. And he signs off on it, which is another reference to the Faustian Pact. He signs off on it, and the archbishop leaves and then comes back. And it's like he has a second thought, and he says, hey, you know that guy Faust? He doesn't refer to him by name. He says, your pardon, sire. You granted that most ill-famed man the emperor's coastline. Yet on this shall fall the ban, unless you grant the holy purse as contrite truant, thereto the tithe and rent and bounties thence accruant. The emperor says peevishly, well, the land's not there, it lies beneath the ocean's swell. The archbishop says, who has the right and patience wins his day as well. Your word shall be our bond, may lapse of time not flout it. Exit. The emperor alone, why not sign over all the realm while we're about it? Which they basically have done in his deal with Mephistopheles. Okay, so that's Act 4, and now we are up to the final scene, Act 5, in which Faust now shifts into utopian technological mode, and utopias always fail. There's never yet been one that has succeeded to reclaim land from the sea and get Mephistopheles to help him with this last rather pathetic dream, that all of this has come to a pathetic dream to build suburbs. It's pretty shameful, but yet Goethe rewards him with an apotheosis in heaven, as we'll see in Act 5 here.